Hello there my RPG lovers and welcome to another video. Larian is a very interesting and ambitious studio. Ever since their humble beginnings, it was very obvious that the main goal of this studio was to make a fun game.
I know you want to make the perfect game, but this is not the way!
Whether that's Diablo-like RPG, third-person action RPG, or turn-based tactical RPG. And whatever this was.
What a nincompoop.
This studio was never afraid to experiment with their games, which is not something you can say for a lot of game studios. But it seems like they found a sweet spot with the Divinity Original Sin series, and they just continue the same design philosophy with Baldur's Gate 3. While I personally would like to see another third-person action RPG from Larian, I highly doubt that will ever happen. When it comes to the game, which is the main topic of this video, a lot of people don't even know it exists, unfortunately. I'm willing to bet that some of you who clicked on this video will expect to see Original Sin 2 review.
Go on, keep moving.
Larian wasn't that creative with the title of these games, up to the point where they had to put a disclaimer on Steam if you accidentally end up on this page. It's a jumbled mess and it's kinda sad actually, because this game deserved a lot better.
I'm flattered, but I'm afraid this is neither the time nor the place for frivolities and frolicking.
Divinity II Draconis came out in 2009 for PC and Xbox 360. The reception of this game was decent, but it definitely got overlooked and it had a very quiet release. Unfortunately, Larian wasn't able to change this, even though they re-released the game a couple of times. Shortly after the release of one and only DLC for the game called Flames of Vengeance, they released the Dragon Knight Saga. This was basically the complete package where we get the base game along with the DLC, but Larian also included a huge balancing patch within this package. It had a lot of changes to the base game based on community feedback. And then finally we got Developer's Cut in the late 2012. This version of the game allows you to enable cheats and play around with various aspects of the game that were inaccessible before. This is the only digital version of the game that you can get today on your PC, by the way. That being said, I don't think that changing the name of the game was a good idea because it only makes things more confusing. So nowadays we have two completely different games by the same studio with the same name, kinda. It's really dumb, but it is what it is. But what about the game itself, C4G? Is it any good? Well, I'm glad you asked.
But I don't waste words on you no longer.
Divinity 2 starts off with a cutscene that doesn't tell you much. There is this bald guy who is obviously evil and a guy with sparkly eyes chasing a dragon. There is no voice acting in this cutscene or any explanation at all. Shortly after this cutscene you get to make your own character. The character customization is extremely limited, up to the point where it almost feels pointless, to be honest. No matter which options you pick, you'll get to meet at least a couple of same looking characters in the first 15 minutes of the game. But you're going to wear a helmet all the time, so who cares anyway? I'm not saying that the game doesn't have unique looking characters, but they're few and far between. Those unique models are reserved for a couple of very important characters, which is understandable when you have to cut some corners. Everyone else looks like they have a bunch of evil clones running around. To be honest, I don't really care that much, especially because the game is really silly in general. For the most part, it doesn't take itself too seriously, and those moments will probably be the highlights of your experience if you plan to play this game.
What's the matter with you? You look like you've seen a ghost!
However, the main story of the game has a more serious tone, and unfortunately it falls flat to its face in those segments for a couple of reasons that we're going to talk about. I think Larian got a lot better when it comes to storytelling with their newer games. They kept the same writing style in Original Sin, and the humor is still the most prominent aspect of those games. The only major difference between Divinity 2 and Original Sin games when it comes to this is the effectiveness of the story itself when it needs to be more serious. Original Sin games are much better on these fields. They manage to tell a compelling story that gets really dark at times while still retaining most of the humor from prior games. Divinity 2 is not that convincing with those serious parts of the story, and one of the major reasons for that is the underwhelming antagonist. You know, the bald guy from the initial cutscene called Damien, and he's the guy you need to stop from destroying the world.
Realize that all you do is in vain. The pieces are set, and the game is about to begin.
While the premise of the main story just screams cliché, the actual story itself is pretty interesting. And there are definitely some memorable characters that you're going to meet throughout the game. By the way, you don't have to worry about any major spoilers in this video. Although I will have a separate section in the video where I discuss the ending of the game and some other major spoilers. I'll make sure you can skip that part of the video if you wish by clicking on the timestamp, so don't worry. Anyway, the main story has a couple of interesting twists and turns, and the first one happens right after the tutorial section of the game. You start off as the member of an elite soldier unit called the Dragon Slayers. The name of this unit should give you a hint what they're all about. On the other side we have Dragon Knights, the chosen champions of real dragons who can transform into, well, dragons. The Slayers had been hunting Dragon Knights for God knows how long, because they killed Lucian the Divine. Lucian the Divine was actually the player character from the first Divinity game, Divine Divinity. Oh yeah, by the way, about 5 months ago I asked my community what's the RPG with the worst name, and Divine Divinity came at the top in more than a few top comments. Anyway, you don't get to learn a lot about the story from the tutorial section though. Commander Rhodes is the first person you talk with, and she tells you to talk with another Slayer in the village, so you can complete the initiation. You can probably tell what kind of experience you can expect from the story from just speaking to people in the village. From the very beginning, almost every dialogue line that you can select is filled with jokes and references.
Here lies Sleepy Joe, doing what he does best.
This persists through the whole game, and more than often it gets really ridiculous.
You are starting to vex me, servant of the serpent.
This time I'll see you in pieces once more, prostitute of the pervert. What the fuck?
Your tongue is still sharp as always.
The game made me laugh out loud in some dialogue situations, and that's always a big plus in my book. As for the references, a lot of them are kinda subtle, but some of them are really aggressive. You'll find references to movies, TV shows, and other games. Larian just didn't hold back when it comes to this, and it kinda fits with the silly mood of the game.
Tibus!
Knock them! Tobalist!
Greta!
Go, go, Power Ranger! Crackosaurus!
You can expect a lot of dark humor as well, which is not that surprising. I mean, big part of the game is about necromancers and zombies, so what's not to like? It might not be everyone's cup of tea, but I enjoyed it immensely. Because I'm a sick son of a bitch. The dialogue itself is presented very well. You only get a couple of sentences from all NPCs, and all the extra information is usually optional. Unless we're talking about a really important part of the main story, where NPCs will usually have a bit longer monologues, but that doesn't happen that often. On the other side of this spectrum, we have something that's not so optional: unskippable cutscenes. Yeah, it's one of the most annoying things you'll have to deal with in this game. It's especially annoying if you play this game on higher difficulties like I did. I kinda feel the need to tell you this even before we get to the gameplay parts. You should absolutely avoid hard and nightmare difficulties, but we'll get to that. You're pretty much forced to manually save the game right after the cutscene ends, which can put you in a huge disadvantage sometimes when a fight is about to happen. To make things even worse, your character always sheathes his weapons in a cutscene, so by the time you get your weapons ready, you usually get blasted in the face before the fight even begins. You take some really cheap damage because of this. And I don't think I have to spend a lot of time trying to explain why unskippable cutscenes are a huge problem. The game does have an autosave feature, but it's not very good. I highly recommend saves coming with a quick save button if you want to preserve your sanity. Anyway, to conclude the dialogue part, I always look forward to speaking with new NPCs just to see what kind of dumb shit my character can say next. But if you expect to experience some deep conversations and very engaging storytelling, you'll probably get disappointed. Although the game does have a decent lore, I guess, which was heavily expanded in original Sin games. Speaking of which, let's continue with the main story. Becoming a Dragon Slayer comes with a couple of useful perks. Some of them are cosmetic like the grey eyes, while others give you the ability to read minds and see ghosts of long dead people. Shortly after the game begins, you'll get all of the mentioned abilities by officially turning into a Dragon Slayer. Then the game makes up a really poor excuse for starting as a fresh level 1 character. Apparently you have been training for years to become a Slayer, and all of that will be lost once you accept the gift of becoming one.
The real drawback is this. The spell was not originally designed for the brain of a human, so to make place for it, you will lose your active knowledge of your years as a Slayer.
Yeah, sounds like a great excuse. Anyway, the tutorial section of the game allows you to try out 3 different styles of combat. This only gets you one starting ability and a weapon, but the game has a classless system in general, so you can mix and match abilities however you want. We'll talk about that when we get to the gameplay section soon enough. The ability to read minds is the most unique feature you get as a Dragon Slayer. Being able to see ghosts is like whatever, you're going to fight and meet a ton of them throughout the game, it doesn't feel so special. And speaking of ghosts, this is one of the parts where you can see the lack of budget for this game. The same model for the ghost is used for pretty much every other ghost you're going to see in the game. And I'm not a huge fan of this design, because it looks bizarre for the sake of being bizarre. It's not a big deal, but it's worth mentioning. As for the mind reading, you can find a lot of useful information from people like this. Not just from people, but pretty much all creatures you can speak with in the game. For example, you can find out the location of the key for the chest or some useful information about a particular quest you took. Or in some cases you get extra ability point to spend, which is really useful. There is a slight penalty for experience points each time you use this ability, but it's not a huge deal. Although it could be a problem if you try and read everyone's mind, and it will affect the process of leveling up. So yeah, the mind read ability is the bigger part of the game in general. Right after the tutorial section, you and all other slayers end up in the Broken Valley. There has been sightings of a Dragon Knight Talana, who's supposed to be the last Dragon Knight, as in last Dragon Knight in general. Commander Road then gives you a very simple tasks in the village. You need to ask around if anyone saw the dragon, and then you have to kill some skeletons in the crypt. And right after you complete those initial main quests, she's like, okay, now we're going to go and kill the dragon while you wait at the village because you are still a noob slayer. What's interesting about this main quest, and a lot of other main quests actually, is the quest notes in the journal, or the lack of them. It's like you don't have a main quest at all, just because you're not supposed to do anything, according to Commander Rhodes. At least that's how I interpreted this. A bunch of other main quests you get throughout the game will work the same, you'll just have to figure out how things work by yourself. But the game has quest marks, and I'm still not entirely sure how they work. The location for the main quest is usually visible on the map, while the majority of side quests won't have any indication. Unless they do, sometimes. It's very inconsistent. You shouldn't expect to rely on quest marks that much, because even when the game points you in the direction where you need to go, you usually have to do something extra in order to continue. If you watch my RPG reviews, you'll probably know that I personally prefer when you have to discover things by yourself, so I don't have any problems with this.
Speak the word so that you may pass. Oh yes, indeed.
Another really impressive thing about this particular quest is the item you get as a reward. The same quest item can be used in a couple of different ways throughout the game, and some other quests as well. It's not like the game tells you this, you can only discover it by yourself. I won't spoil anything though, but it left a lasting impression on me, so I had to mention it. Speaking of that, there are a bunch of lootable items that you have to interact with in order to complete particular quests. And a lot of quests in the game are overlapping, which means that the questing system is a lot deeper than it might seem at first. Although the game has a lot of quests that try to test the player, of which I'm not particularly fond of. That's because of the trial and error nature of those quests, because you'll eventually get them right, even randomly.
I'm afraid not.
However, the game also has quests that you can fail if you get them wrong, which is a great thing actually if you ask me. There are not a ton of quests like this, but it's still appreciated. And what's perhaps the most important thing when it comes to quests, you always have at least a couple of different ways to complete them. The consequences for your decisions in quest solving are well designed as well. These quests usually have a very different outcome depending on your choice of action. For example, in one of the dungeons I was randomly exploring, I came across this crazy chicken room.
What is this? A chicken run and a chicken room?
You get to loot a chicken rune here, but at the time I couldn't do anything with it. This was just an optional side room of the dungeon, but later I accepted the quest for some necromancer who was about to destroy the whole village. And you can resolve this quest peacefully by getting him the chicken rune, which allows him to have unlimited fried chicken. There are many fun and crazy quests like this, but I won't spoil it for you.
Sic transit Gloria Mundi! No, that one doesn't work either.
However, the main quest is completely linear. When it comes to the story itself, it's always the same outcome. But even some main quests have different options that you have to pick, even though they don't exactly affect the main story. Speaking of the main story, once you continue the main quest, you'll find Dragon Knight Talana at the brink of death. And we could say that this is where the main story actually begins. Captain Road was responsible for inflicting the mortal wound to Talana. But right before she dies, she managed to turn you into a Dragon Knight, because your mind is still vulnerable from becoming a Slayer. I mean, it was pretty easy to figure out that eventually your character would be able to turn into a dragon. It's on the damn box of the game, by the way. But I still like this little story twist, even though it was very predictable. From this point on, you'll get to hear Talana's voice inside your head, and she will guide you through the rest of the story, in a way.
You are a dragon now. Show that curse accursed lot the might of the ancient race. Burn their flesh and topple their towers.
Her ultimate mission was to kill Damien because she saw the future and what kind of destruction will Damien bring if he's not stopped. So this becomes your main mission and you go through various main quests to figure out how to stop Damien. With the help of Talana and some new characters you'll meet along the way, like Zandalor, who claims to be a protector of Dragon Knights. I can't really go deeper than this without spoiling anything major. So to conclude my spoiler-free thoughts about the main story, it was interesting to see what's going to happen next, and some characters are very memorable. However, I despise the ending of the main story, which I won't spoil here of course. Like I said before, Damien is a really weak antagonist. You start seeing him a lot after you turn into a Dragon Knight, and he always behaves like the cringiest bad guy from a low-budget action movie.
I shall finally remove the pawn that is blocking my offensive. Farewell then. It has been a pleasure.
I'll leave the rest of this discussion for the spoiler section of the video. Before we get to the gameplay part of the video, let's talk about the visuals. I already touched upon the character models a bit and the obvious lack of resources. I mean, Divinity II wasn't a AAA RPG by any means, Larian was a much smaller studio back then. On the other side, I have to give a lot of credit to Larian when it comes to other parts of the character models. You're going to see a lot of cool armor sets on NPCs, and more importantly, you'll be able to acquire a bunch of unique armor sets. I would argue this is even more important to get right, at least from the gameplay perspective. As someone who holds visual progression in high regard, I was quite satisfied how Divinity II handled this. When it comes to graphics in general, I always had very mixed feelings about this game. The graphical fidelity is obviously not the strongest aspect of this game, especially today after 13 years. But even when the game came out, the visual experience was far from impressive. If you watch my reviews, you probably know that the artistic style of the game is always a lot more important to me. The art style is not exactly unique, it's actually quite generic, but not in a bad way if you ask me. To put it this way, it's enough for me to recognize this game by just watching a random screenshot. But that's pretty much everything I have to say about the art style. However, we have to point out some very bad parts about the visuals of this game. This is mostly related to the lack of detail in a couple of major locations that you're going to explore. A lot of these locations in the game look visually flat and devoid of any detail, especially the ground clutter. Even the areas which have a lot more detailed terrain are not that great to look at. This is some very basic visual style all around. The Broken Valley is definitely the best looking location in the game and it feels the most developed in general. The island looks extremely boring to me and it's easily the worst looking area in the game. Orobas Fjords is just a little bit better, even though this zone has a strong reason for such different design compared to other zones. That's still not an excuse for looking extremely generic though. I played the game on the high settings and 4K resolution and most of the textures are pretty crisp. But occasionally you're going to stumble upon some very low res textures. I think the interiors look way superior to open areas in general. Larian managed to cram a lot of details in these dungeons, houses and pretty much every other instance area that you're going to explore. Open areas just feel very lifeless to me, except the first village and the city of Alarot in the DLC I guess. Lighting in the game is extremely basic, the trees are pretty much static and there is no day and night cycle. Instead, you get these awkward scenery transitions when the game tries to set a particular mood.
Die!
That's not bad per se, but it's not very good either. Wow, it sounds like I hate the game or something, but I actually don't, trust me. As for the performance, I had zero issues with the frame rate on highest details and 4K resolution. Just be sure to cap the frame rate of the game on 60 within your GPU drivers and disable it in the game menu. Otherwise, you'll get the feeling like the environment is laggy when you turn your camera. Now let's finally talk about the gameplay.
I don't feel too good.
Like I said before, I always felt like the main goal of this studio is to make a fun game. Even before you get a weapon in the beginning, you can mess around with the combat system and kick chickens to death. You'll immediately notice some over-the-top animations and more than generous jumping ability. Actually, the jumping becomes a lot better when you become a Dragon Knight, shortly after the beginning of the game. I just love jumping in this game and this is pretty much how I explore the world. Yeah, walking normally is for losers. Anyway, the combat in Divinity II is fast-paced, but you also have a tactical pause button, which I never use that much to be honest. The most useful function of this feature is to automatically pause the game when your health is low, so you can heal, but you can also issue commands from the pause menu if you wish. The feel of the combat is decent, and I always have a lot of fun with trying out different abilities and mix and matching them to create a unique build. However, there are some parts of this combat system which are pretty bad, up to the point where it almost made me quit this playthrough because I got really mad. But you shouldn't get turned off by this, because this is mostly a critique for the Nightmare difficulty. I played almost the entire game on Nightmare, which was probably the worst decision I made when it comes to this game. It's absolutely an awful way of doing a difficulty in a game of this type, and I highly recommend playing it on normal. Trust me, you'll thank me later. I don't want to sound like I hate the gameplay in this game, because I don't. I think it's pretty fun in general, and it's one of the reasons why you should give this game a chance if you never played it before. So let's focus on the good stuff first. Getting stronger in this game and the whole progression system in general is really good. Leveling up always gives you a considerable power boost, no matter where you choose to dump your ability points. You also have classic RPG stat points that you get to distribute. If you're wondering if these stat points are actually important to keep in mind, I can assure you they are. Most of the time you die in combat, there is a big chance that some of your stats are low, especially these stats right here. Higher difficulties are more unforgiving when it comes to this, but you should still pay attention to your character stats even on normal. The thing is, even though the game has an action combat system, you can't rely 100% on your mechanical abilities. Dodging left and right and jumping will allow you to avoid 80% of attacks, but this is a game where you can't avoid getting hit no matter which playstyle you choose. That's where the character stats come into play, because they allow you to mitigate a lot of damage. If you approach the gameplay from the pure action perspective, you're probably going to be a bit disappointed. That's why the way you build your character is really important. Stacking a lot of health potions is a decent tactic as well, of course, but the game is not exactly generous with healing potions, especially in the beginning. Even the potions you can buy are limited. When it comes to the controls, they are decent, but I wouldn't exactly call them snappy, mainly because the majority of actions in combat have long animation lock, whether that's regular attacks, using abilities, pulling out your weapons, or getting hit. All of those actions will make you lose the control of your character, and there is no way to cancel your actions. This game has a soft lock-on system that functions pretty well. Switching between enemies is almost seamless, no matter which weapon you use. You just have to face the center of the camera at the enemy. I always prefer the soft lock-on system instead of a more traditional lock-on which plays with your camera. When it comes to my character, I wanted to focus on melee and some ranged abilities with the bow. The game has a very useful switch for 3 different weapon sets of your choice. This is probably the most seamless feature in the combat system, because there is zero delay when you switch your weapons. You can even do it while jumping. What's even better when it comes to this, the game is smart enough to automatically equip a corresponding weapon type when you use your abilities. So for example, you can shoot your arrows with a bow and use ranged abilities. But if you try to use some melee abilities while shooting with a bow, the game will automatically switch to your previously selected weapon slot and seamlessly cast the ability. This definitely deserves some praise, because it's a great feature. So you don't have to worry about mixing mage, ranger and warrior abilities, everything you cast is seamless. The skill tree offers you a pretty decent amount of active and passive abilities. There are no restrictions when it comes to getting these abilities, as long as your level is high enough. But naturally, your most effective abilities will be the ones that synergize with the stats you increase upon leveling up, as well as the gear you have, of course. All abilities work off mana, so no matter which playstyle you go for, your mana is going to be the primary resource. There are some skills you can get which makes this a lot easier, like Mana Leech, but you're still going to have a lot of mana problems, at least I did on Nightmare difficulty. I don't hate this part of the combat design, but I don't like it either. If there is even a slightly longer fight, you're always going to have mana problems, even as a pure melee character. Later in the game, potions become a lot more accessible, so it's not a huge issue. There is a way to make potions if you have the ingredients, even before you unlock the battle tower, which is your main hub area. But yeah, not a huge fan of using the mana for everything you cast. The combat itself is not exactly impactful and weighty, it's definitely more on the floaty side. The animations for the melee combo are really fun though. The nature of this combat system leans a bit too much on spamming normal attacks, but it still manages to feel fun if you ask me. Even though you can use dodge and use jump to avoid getting hit, there are no actual iframes. That means that you always have to be physically out of the reach to avoid getting hit. Invincibility frames would be a lot better choice, and it could have potentially saved the game from some problems which are very prominent. So let's talk about those problems, shall we? If I would have to point my finger at the worst feature / mechanic of this action combat system, that would be the unavoidable damage. Instead of talking a lot, let me just show you. Doesn't seem very fun, does it? There is a certain spell which most enemies use that will always hit you. No matter if you're out of the reach, behind an object or whatever, you're always getting hit. This spell is so overused, it almost ruins the whole game. The majority of bosses you're going to fight in the game also have this fucking spell. The thing is, it's not even the damage from the spell that's annoying. Do you remember what I said before about the animation lock? Whenever you get hit by this spell or some other ability, your character gets staggered. And that opens up the window for enemies to do some serious damage to you.
My wounds are grave.
You're always going to fight multiple enemies in the game, so this was always a problem to me. I don't know who thought this was a good idea. I guess it's a lot less frustrating on normal difficulty, but that's not an excuse. Speaking of boss fights, they didn't age so well. The game's idea of doing difficult boss fights is to summon a bunch of regular enemies as well. It's a very cheap way of increasing the difficulty of the fight because the bosses don't have any unique abilities. It's pretty much the same ability pool that your character can use, they hit hard and they have a lot of health. Fighting Ball was the most frustrating experience in the game until I figured out I can aggro these fuckers one at a time. Then it was a pretty easy fight even on Nightmare, but this just proves my points. On the bright side, the game has a decent amount of different looking enemies to fight. The goblins are a bit overused though.
Lower prices mean less gold, but more sales, which equals more gold.
When it comes to the dragon gameplay, it's more of a gimmick than anything else, to be honest. Although the second major area of the game is completely designed around this feature. Don't get me wrong, it's definitely not a bad experience, but the whole dragon form is revolved around destroying towers and occasionally killing some dragons with a single button. Flying around in the second area is really fun though, but this place is not nearly big enough to justify the flying mechanic. It's obvious that Larian was a little bit too ambitious when it comes to this idea. You have a separate skill tree for the dragon, but it's completely pointless if you ask me. I would prefer if Larian designed all areas for the human form, to be honest. You can still use the human form in all locations, but this area is obviously designed around the dragon form, which kinda hinders the exploration outside of it. So like I said, it's not bad, it's just way too ambitious, and that's probably the main reason why it feels so underdeveloped. Judging by the DLC, Larian also thinks that the dragon form was a hit and miss feature. 99% of the DLC is designed around the human form, so you be the judge. Fun fact, there was supposed to be another form which was halfway between the dragon and human forms. And that form was supposed to be very powerful for fighting on the ground. This is really interesting, and once again you can see how ambitious Larian was. Speaking about underdeveloped features, we have to mention the battle tower you get quite late in the game. Actually, I wouldn't call the battle tower underdeveloped, it was just introduced very late in the game. The battle tower is your hub area where you have the complete list of features which the game offers. You can store items, mix potions, enchant armors and weapons, and even create your own monster from various body parts you loot. This is a very cool feature actually, that you can unlock even before you get a tower. Your monster gets different abilities depending on which body parts you choose. So even if you don't decide to invest points into summoning creatures, you will have at least one loyal monster. The only problem with this has nothing to do with the feature itself. The AI for the monster is pretty bad. More than often he can just decide to not show up in a fight because he's bored or something. It also doesn't help at all that all enemies on the screen will usually attack you all the time. But the Necromancer is not the only one. You can find people in the Broken Valley who can offer you all of these services which the Battle Tower has. The Battle Tower just puts everything together and it makes things a lot more convenient. The Battle Tower is a really cool concept and I love the way it looks, but you can only unlock this place after about 15 or even 20 hours of gameplay, depending on how you play of course. And after you unlock the tower, you can get around 20 more hours of gameplay at best from the rest of the game, not counting the DLC. If you ask me, I think the Battle Tower system would work a lot better if you get to unlock it early in the game. But by itself it's a really cool hub area that you can teleport to anytime you want. When it comes to the world design, I think it's pretty solid all around. Like I said before, the interiors are way superior to open areas in the game. Most of the fun things you get to do in the game are happening inside dungeons and closed areas. You'll find a lot of optional puzzles to solve, which usually give you a very good item. The game has a decent amount of jumping puzzles, and that's great because jumping is really fun in this game. Exploring open areas in the game is still fun because you can find a lot of secrets and some interesting quests. What makes the exploration more dangerous and more exciting, if you ask me, is the lack of any level scaling. That means that all enemies have fixed levels, which can render some locations inaccessible until you get stronger. I think this creates an enjoyable leveling up experience, despite all of the problems I mentioned with the combat. I personally really prefer this over level scaling in general. The last thing I want to mention is something that I only touched upon early in the video. The itemization in the game is really satisfying, and you'll have a lot of weapons and armors to loot. Especially when it comes to set items, which more than often have a lot of individual pieces in the set. Like, a lot of pieces. I'm pretty sure that most set items are not random drops, but you will be able to buy some of them at certain merchants. However, the game introduces some very high quality non-set items later in the game. But I wouldn't say they exactly make the set items obsolete, since some of the bonuses you get from completing the set are really strong. Completing the set items is another thing which makes the replay value of the game stronger. The replay value of the game is pretty decent in general, even though the main story itself always stays the same. And speaking of that, let's talk a little bit about some spoilers. You can skip this part by pressing the next timestamp in the video. I was really disappointed with how the game ended, and I know a lot of people felt the same. It's probably pointless to bitch about this now because the DLC just continues where the main game ended. That's also why I don't really want to talk about this DLC, since we're going to spoil the whole game for people who didn't play it. Anyway, you have been lied to ever since you became a Dragon Knight. The voice inside your head was not from Talana, it was from Damien's wife all along. You were basically just her puppet, and she used you to get her life back, by altering the history and stopping her from getting killed. So in the end, your character gets trapped in the void for eternity, along with Lucian the Divine, who's actually alive. Yeah, you're not dead, you're just trapped in this place. I wouldn't mind the main story that much if we had the chance to figure out that Talana is not the person who is guiding us. That would open up the possibility for multiple endings, and if that was the case, I would actually love the main story in general. However, deceiving the player through the entire story is a very cheap way of telling the story, in my opinion. It's not very RPG-ish, I guess, and the plot twist can just make the players mad than anything else. Because they don't have the control to change anything, the game just gets you by the balls, and that's it. Literally from the very beginning of the game.
What? It cannot be. How did this happen?
And I don't want to sound like a broken record, but Damien really sucks. He's a very generic bad guy who had the chance to kill you God knows how many times in the main story. If he actually knew the plans of his wife, keeping you alive would make more sense, but he didn't know this, as we can see from the final cutscene.
I battled tirelessly to release you from death's grip, and here you are, alive and free without my help. How?
So it just makes him stupid and boring. As for the DLC, it's a lot more satisfying conclusion to the main story. You actually get to kill Yirna, which was really satisfying. But Flames of Vengeance DLC leaves a lot to be desired. The city of Alaroth has interesting quests, and some of them are even better than most quests from the base game. But you're pretty much stuck in here. I don't like being permanently stuck in one location, especially if the game had open areas before. Larian kinda gave up on the dragon form in this DLC, even though you still get to use it every once in a while in some very linear sections. The DLC will automatically start when you finish the main game, so it doesn't even feel like a DLC nowadays. The city is fun to explore, but not so fun to justify the whole DLC that's based around it. The locations from the base game are not accessible because of what happened in the story, but that's still not a good excuse to completely limit your movement to this single location. I still enjoyed it quite a lot since I love the game in general. Before we wrap this up, let's take a moment to talk about the sound design. I love the soundtrack for this game, even though there are some tracks which seem out of place a bit. The Broken Valley has a really chill soundtrack and it's definitely my favorite. The sound effects are a hit and miss, but they are serviceable. The majority of combat sound effects are really sharp, which is a bit off-putting to me. Like I said before, the combat lacks the feeling of weight, and the sound effects are not helping at all, but I heard a lot worse. The voice acting has a really special charm to it. I could recognize this game by just listening to some random voice lines in my sleep, and that has to mean something, right? That's probably because of the writing itself, but the voices you're going to hear are decent for the most part.
Seek out the men and women who reside here and benefit from their knowledge.
Sure, you're going to find some characters with very silly voices, but even those are quite charming if you ask me.
Peggy acts like she's a natural blonde. Who does she think she's fooling?
I might be biased when it comes to this, so you be the judge. Although pretty much all important characters in the game have solid voice acting.
Yes, I can see the bloodlust in your eyes. So young and so designed to kill.
I was really curious about the Xbox 360 version of this game, so I had to try it out. There is no official controller support on the PC for some reason. That's one of the reasons why I wanted to play this game a bit on Xbox 360. And to be honest, the controller scheme is terrible on Xbox controller. I mean, you have to use the right trigger to jump, which is really awkward. You can map your abilities to A, B, Y, X and the D-pad, which is actually quite functional. But the most interesting part when it comes to controls is the active lock-on system. You might remember that I mentioned how PC version of the game only has a soft lock-on system, and how you can actually use a dedicated button to lock on the PC version as well. I don't believe I mentioned that. But even so, the PC version of the game just permanently highlights the enemy with the lock-on. However, the lock-on on the Xbox behaves like a traditional lock-on system, but you have to actively hold the left trigger and your character will circle around the target. This definitely changes the feel of the gameplay in general, but like I said, the control scheme is pretty awkward on Xbox. This version of the game has a certain charm to it though. The UI is obviously completely different and it's worse compared to the PC version, but I wouldn't say it's terrible. All features from the PC version are there, they are just presented differently. The zoomed in camera was probably a technical limitation rather than a design choice, but I have to say I kinda like it. Unfortunately, the PC version doesn't have any camera controls, you just get a fixed angle and that's it. I would like to play with a more zoomed in angle like this. That would be everything I consider interesting from this version of the game. If you decide to try out this game, you can now use my GOG link and you'll support my channel by doing so. I finally managed to set up my affiliate links with GOG, so pretty much every game that I review from now on will have my links to GOG store. I'm pretty sure Divinity 2 will be on a huge discount at the time of publishing this video. Even a lot of previous games that I covered in videos have GOG links in the description and usually in the pinned comments. I also have a Patreon page if you want to support my channel directly. Even the cheapest membership level means a lot for a small creator like myself. But hey, the best way to support the channel is actually free by just watching the video, pressing the thumbs up button and subscribing to the channel. That'll be all, and I'll see you in the next one.